Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Insight Hour. We're just going to give it a couple of minutes to let people in. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the IDA Insight Hour on language. We're just going to give it a couple of minutes to let people join before we kick off. Great to see so many people here. I'll give it another minute just to let everyone get ready and to join. All right, without further ado, I think we should start. Welcome, everyone, to today's IDA Insight Hour on language. I am Kristen Tua. I'm the communications manager at IDA. We are a network of over 2,000 employer members across the UK, and our mission is to equip employers to support all of their employees impacted by domestic abuse and to help share best practice with other employers. We endeavour to bring about constructive change, leading to a society where survivors thrive and where domestic abuse is not tolerated. I'm sure there are going to be many questions for our speakers today, which we're going to respond to at the end of the session after our discussion. So please, if you do have a question, use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen to share that question with us. You'll also have access to the chat function, which is managed by one of the IDA team, and please feel free to introduce yourself and post in the chat. We encourage everyone to post about the webinar on LinkedIn and on other social media platforms, and please tag us when you do. As ever, though, please be mindful of the impact on others and what you choose to say in the chat or on social media. We're going to be recording this Insight Hour, and we will post the recording to our YouTube library tomorrow. So if you haven't signed up to our newsletters, please do so, because then you'll also get all the other updates of what IDA is up to. So today's session is really about language and why language matters in ways that we talk about domestic abuse. We're going to be talking about the impact of the language that we use on people's ability to disclose their experiences, their ability to feel trust and to feel safe at work. We're going to talk about what inclusive language looks like, particularly when it comes to gender inclusivity, and also how workplace communications, so when you raise awareness of domestic abuse in your workplace, how you can best communicate effectively in thinking about the language that you use. We'll also touch upon some language that we might want to steer more clear of and is less appropriate for a workplace context. And I think it's important to begin by saying that language is not static. It reflects political and social changes in our society. It can both reinforce and challenge power dynamics, and the language that we use to talk about a range of different social issues, including domestic abuse, has changed so much as society has evolved. I mean, what started out as family trouble has evolved through phases of battery to a domestic, and more recently, domestic violence. And now we really talk mostly about domestic abuse to really capture the full range of abusive behaviors. Domestic abuse has also shaped more of our modern language than I think that we know. For example, the expression rule of thumb is rooted in Old English common law, which historically suggested that a husband was permitted to correct his wife physically, provided that the instrument used was no wider than his thumb. So society has influenced how we talk about domestic abuse, but domestic abuse has also influenced our society. And so without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome the first speaker of the day, who's going to take us through setting the scene, through Andrea DeVoe. would you like to come on?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm going to share my screen now. Just confirming that everybody can see it.
Yes, all good.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you for having me. As mentioned, my name is Andrea DeVoe. I am a former newspaper editor-in-chief, and I led editorial teams across 2 countries in 2 languages. I know the realities of newsrooms very well: deadlines, breaking news, limited information, legal constraints. So somewhere around 3 years ago, seeing how sexual assault is now the most underreported serious crime in the UK, I founded Outcry Witness, a platform helping survivors document abuse safely and anonymously. Then I started noticing something at the intersection of the 2 fields. The way abuse is reported can often distort people's understanding of it, to the detriment of victims, of course, which means that people aren't only traumatized by what happened to them, they are re-traumatized by how what happened is described. After years of doing this job, I know this wasn't about bad intentions from journalists or media companies. It was about patterns, patterns so normalized we often stop seeing them. That's why I launched The Right Words, not because journalism is broken, but because I know from my experience that we can do better. Now, this isn't simply about grammar. Language influences who we instinctively see as responsible. It affects whether people feel believed. It influences whether someone recognizes what they're experiencing is abuse, and whether those people feel able to ask for help. Every word, as my image shows, creates a ripple. And individually, those ripples might seem small, but over time, they shape a culture. Now, whenever we're writing or speaking about domestic abuse, I encourage people to ask 3 very simple questions. First one, who did what? It sounds almost too simple, but it's surprising how often the answer actually isn't obvious. One of the things I started noticing, first in journalism and later in organizational language, more generally, was just how easy the person responsible could disappear from sentence. Nobody was necessarily deliberately trying to hide them. It was just the way we'd become used to writing or communicating. And once I noticed that pattern, I couldn't stop seeing it. Now, the second question is, what happened? Again, very simple on the face, but we often rely on language that's very broad when answering that question. We talk about relationship issues, a difficult situation, or an incident. Sometimes that's appropriate because we genuinely don't know what has happened. But where we do know, precision matters. If somebody has disclosed, for example, coercive control, calling it relationship issues, it doesn't make, calling it that doesn't make the description more neutral. It makes it less accurate. The same applies to domestic abuse, stalking, or harassment. Using language that makes us that's vague and makes us more comfortable doesn't improve the accuracy or the understanding of what's happened. So the more clearly we describe behavior, the easier it becomes for others to understand what they're looking at, including the person at the center of it. And finally, does my wording make responsibility unmistakably clear? This is really the thread that runs through what we do with the Right Words campaign. I'm interested in where responsibility sits within a sentence of starting to read an article. Does the wording naturally direct our attention towards the behavior, or does it leave the behavior sitting quietly somewhere in the background while somebody else becomes the focus? It's a subtle distinction, but subtle distinctions actually have a habit of shaping the way we think. So those 3 questions are surprisingly effective at highlighting sentences that unintentionally obscure accountability. Now, same facts, different focus. None of these examples change the facts. They simply change where the sentence places our attention. She experienced domestic abuse isn't incorrect, but her partner abused her tells us immediately who committed the abuse. Likewise, the relationship became abusive, um, makes abuse sound like something that happened to the relationship, where one partner repeatedly abused the other, identifies a person's actions. Now, the next one is, and I apologize, I think we're missing an example. The next one is a perfect example of wording that minimizes abuse. A man assaulted his partner. Uh, Immediately tells us who did what, where and to whom, right? And I'm sorry, in my notes I have the fourth example, and I'm not sure why this isn't on the screen. But the fourth one is he disclosed the domestic abuse at work, and he disclosed that his partner abused him. And that is because this example illustrates that the principle applies equally to male victims. And I will make sure to send it across to everybody with the correct examples. Now, our work is not only relevant to journalists. Every organization communicates through policies, emails, training, manager conversations, internal guidance, investigation reports, even everyday conversations between colleagues. Every one of these interactions contributes to organizational culture, which is why language matters far beyond the media. Now, the good news is that this doesn't require a complete rewrite of your policies. Often small changes make a significant difference. First one, use active voice where it's appropriate. Include the perpetrator where context allows. And avoid language that unintentionally turns abuse into something abstract or anonymous. Those small shifts help to make responsibility much clearer. Now, the impact for that, huge. Changing language won't unfortunately end domestic abuse, but better language helps create better conversations and support. Better conversations lead to better understanding, and better understanding makes it easier for organizations to recognize abuse, respond appropriately, and support employees who may need help. That's why I believe language is more than communication. It's part of prevention, it's part of recognition, and it's absolutely a part of culture. Now, the right words is at the moment the largest campaign in the world dedicated to challenging and changing how abuse is reported, and it's growing into a movement involving organizations, institutions, and individuals who believe language should never hide responsibility. Now, if this quick, very short presentation has resonated with you, I'd love for you to explore the campaign, follow our work, or get in touch. The QR code takes you to our Instagram. Thank you for your time. Thank you, Ida, for having me, and I'm happy to take any questions after the session.
Thank you so much, Andrea. That's a really, really helpful introduction to this topic and just really illustrates the power of language and how the way that we talk about or write about domestic abuse can really shape someone's experience of it. And I think that's also so important because a lot of people who experience domestic abuse actually don't recognize it. That behavior has become so normalized for them that if you tell them that what they're experiencing is domestic abuse, some of them might actually react by saying, "No, I'm not," because it's just not the words that they're used to using. So that was a
Or
really
they're not used
helpful,
to, they're not
yeah,
ready to.
exactly. So that was a really, really helpful introduction. Could I invite our other panelists to join us? So we've got Hossam and Emma with us as well. And could I just invite both of you, maybe let's start with Emma, with a quick introduction to who you are and maybe a quick reflection on what we've talked about so far.
Yeah, of course. So I'm Emma Dennis, and I work for Gowling WLG, and we are an international law firm. And I specifically am a senior manager in our diversity and inclusion and wellbeing team. So my role focuses on everything inclusion, wellbeing, and now engagement as well. And as an organisation, we've been focused on putting support in place for our people around domestic abuse for at least the last 10 years. And really interesting listening to what Andrea had to say, because I think language has been a key consideration for us over that time. And I think in a little bit we'll come into more around what we've done and what we've considered. But it definitely is a very powerful tool to open up supports to people.
Thank you so much, Emma. Hossam, over to you.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Hassam Darwish. I'm a learning specialist at Amazon, and I'm part of Amazon Against Abuse, our Amazon employee-led group that supports colleagues affected by domestic abuse. We aim to create a safe space where people can access support, access resources, and to connect with others who understand what they are going through. Alongside my role at Amazon, my academic background is in applied linguistics. I have a PhD in applied linguistics from the University of Bedfordshire. That's why I'm particularly interested in how language shapes the way people understand domestic abuse, especially in diverse workplaces like Amazon, where people come from so many different cultures, speak many different languages. Going to the question how language is interpreted across cultures, do go ahead with this. Yeah. That's one thing that actually that I have learned is that we can't assume everyone understands the same words in the same way. So let me take the term, for example, domestic abuse. In English, it's broad term. It includes emotional abuse, financial abuse, coercive control, and psychological abuse as well, not just the physical violence. But in many languages, the closest translation is still understood as someone being physically beaten. My native language is Arabic. If I translate domestic abuse, it means physically beaten. So no, it's not correct. So someone might be experiencing coercive control or financial abuse and genuinely think, well, this doesn't apply to me. This is not something that I can do. Another thing that culture influences how people talk about difficult experience. In many cultures, including my own Arabic culture, as I said, people may not come out and say, I am being abused. Instead, they may say things like, uh, things haven't been great at home, or my partner or my husband or my wife is very strict, or I am under a lot of pressure. So they put different codes of what we mean, actually. We will probably miss what they are really trying to tell us if we don't understand the meaning. So language carries cultural values. In many communities, family, honor, privacy, or duty are deeply rooted concepts. So speaking about problems at home can feel like you are betraying your family, not simply asking for help. So that's an important barrier we need to recognize. That's something that we need to be aware of.
Yeah, no, that's such a good point. And I think also just naming abusive behaviors as what they are is so important that we maybe stop talking about like relationship problems, but instead call out things like coercive control for what they are. Because I think it's very empowering for victim survivors to hear other people use that language that maybe they've looked for all of their life, but may never have found in that way. And so they've never actually been able to describe their experiences until they've heard someone else, someone who knows that it is abuse, describe it in that way. So I think that's a really, really great point. And especially as the workforce is so globalized and many of our IDAS members have offices in many different countries, they're tackling different legislations and different definitions of domestic abuse. And so really trying to arrive at a common understanding, I think, is really quite important. And in exploring what that looks like in practice, what that sort of person-centric language means in practice, I'd like to come to Emma for the moment and ask you, what were the language considerations that you had at Gowling when you rolled out your domestic abuse response towards your employees?
I think one of the biggest learning points for us was that language can either make support or resources feel relevant to people, or people not feel it's not for them. So when we first started work in this area, we very much used the term domestic violence. It was a phrase that people recognised and sort of knew what we were talking about. But over time, that's changed, and we had some feedback from some of our colleagues that helped us to see that actually using the term domestic violence was too narrow. So some people didn't see their experience as violence, especially when the abuse was more emotional or financial, coercive or controlling. So what we were doing, they didn't immediately think that related to what they were experiencing. So we changed that a couple of years ago to using domestic abuse in everything that we do. And that's, I think, helped us be clearer into the support that we're offering our people and feels more inclusive of different experiences. I think we've also tried to use language in different ways in some of the communications that we've done. So we've ran poster campaigns over the years to try and enable people to either recognize that they themselves are in an abusive relationship, or to also for others to spot signs that something may be happening with somebody. And we've done that in a number of ways. And one of the ways that relates to what you just mentioned, Kristin, was being really specific on what some of these terms are. So we had one campaign that went through sort of what coercive control was, what financial abuse was, and gave people those insights to be able to sort of sit and look at those posters and think, actually, that's happening to me, and be able to then go and get support. And we're just very conscious of the type of language that we use, particularly around the posters, because they've got to do work very quickly. They've got to get to people, and the messaging has got to get across very quickly. But we don't want to put anything in them that is either frightening or sensationalist or full of language that might cause somebody to feel shame. So there are a lot of considerations there when we're sort of looking at what we share with our people.
Yeah, no. IDA has also created a series of, or lots of different series of posters to hang up in sort of private spaces and in people's offices, such as the back of toilet doors. And it really is, as you say, about that messaging, which is thought-provoking without sort of being overly triggering, like maybe a thought-provoking question, maybe a really impactful statistic, like that can really open people's eyes to what's going on here. And what was the feedback that you got from employees, particularly maybe about like changing the term domestic violence to domestic abuse, and what was the take up really?
It was really positive. So people, like I say, we'd had feedback around changing the term. Um, and the people that had spoken to us about that were obviously really happy that we'd made that change. But then outside of that, we had people get in touch that were like, that's the right thing to do. That feels like it now means something to everybody. We've always had really good engagement in the work that we do around domestic abuse, and we've got domestic abuse champions across the firm. And we do a lot of work in this area and put sessions on for this area. So I would say engagement probably has increased because more people feel that they have a connection with the term rather than thinking it's something that maybe doesn't, like I said earlier, doesn't reflect their experience.
Yeah, no, that's really good to hear and so important. And we've spoken with Gowling employees actually who do have lived experience of domestic abuse and who also say that those posters, the humble analog poster, was
Yeah.
extremely impactful to their experience and making them feel seen as well. I'd like to follow up asking the same question to Hossam really. What approach does Amazon take when it comes to this? I mean, you mentioned that you've got a very diverse workforce, and so it's really important not to let things be lost in translation. So if you would also like to just quickly take us through how you've gone about thinking about language.
Yeah, sure. So, as you said, one thing that we recognized very early in Amazon as a diverse company, that we can't assume everyone understand domestic abuse in the same way. As I said, we have colleagues from all over the world speaking dozens of languages and bringing very different cultural perspectives. So for us, it's not just about translating a poster into another language, but it's about making sure that the meaning is understood to the people. For example, someone might not realize that financial abuse is a form of domestic abuse. In some culture, it's considered completely normal for one partner to control all of the money or make every financial decision. It could be normal in one of the cultures. So if we simply say financial abuse, that term might not resonate to the people or to those people. Instead, we describe everyday situation. For example, are you allowed to access your own bank account? So we make like a scenario. Does someone make you account for every penny you spend? Or we can say, are you prevented from working or earning your own money? So we ask these questions. People may not recognize the label, but they often recognize the experience. And that's usually where the conversation start with us in Amazon. We have also learned not to assume everyone shares the same understanding of domestic abuse. Whenever we use that term, we explain what we mean in plain language. We focus on behaviors rather than labels.
Mm. Oh, no, that's really positive to hear, and I absolutely hear you, especially what you say about economic abuse. And actually, there was research that just came out the other week by a charity called Surviving Economic Abuse, and that research showed that the vast majority of young people, especially young men, did not see a lot of those economically abusive behaviors as problematic. Because, as you say, it can be quite common in so many households for, as you say, one person to maybe control the family's finances. And so maybe not everyone has grown up with asking critical questions about what that really means and what it means when it ventures into the more abusive sphere. So it's so important that we have these conversations, not least with young people. And moving on to, I think, one of the situations that probably scares people the most when it comes to language, which is responding to a direct disclosure. Now, I know the term disclosure of domestic abuse might even be contested among some people because it sounds a little bit, it sounds quite serious and almost like a term that you would use in the criminal justice system, like a disclosure of information. Whereas some people like to use the term sharing, maybe, is something that's a bit more informal. But I think that responding to someone who's telling you actively that they're experiencing domestic abuse can be quite frightening to colleagues, to managers, even to HR, because what do you say when someone comes forward and tells you about their experiences? So maybe Andrea, if you could take us through what is a good way to respond to a disclosure or someone sharing their experiences, maybe for the first time ever, if you could take us through that.
Absolutely. And the first thing I'd like to say is that this isn't about being the language police. It's a scary situation for a lot of people, and I can understand why we can all say the wrong thing in a loaded situation. And even people that have had training in the space can say the wrong thing. Now, the thing to keep in mind is that when someone discloses abuse, the words we choose can really create either safety or unintentionally add to a person's distress. So even well-meaning comments can sound dismissive, judgmental, pressuring, particularly if we ask questions about the person's decisions, minimize their experience, or even sometimes take away their sense of control. Now, a supportive response doesn't require the perfect words. It just requires listening without judgment, acknowledging what has been shared, and basically responding in a way that respects that person's autonomy. I have some examples. Now, the first thing is acknowledging the disclosure. So something along the lines of, thank you for telling me. I know this can't have been easy. I'm really glad you felt able to tell me, or I'm sorry you're going through this. Thank you for trusting me with something so personal. And then, of course, the believing without judgment, which is very important. I believe you, very simple one. What you shared matters. You don't have to justify what happened to me because we've seen that so many times. I'm here to listen. Very simple, very short examples that can create that level of trust and safety for the person doing the disclosure. And then there's giving them back a sense of agency. Would you like to tell me more, or would you rather we just talk about it? Just the basic things you want to share right now, or we can go at whatever pace feels right and safe for you. You don't have to make any decisions today. And a very simple one is, how can I best support you?
Mm. I
Um,
second. Yeah, sorry.
sorry, go on.
No, go for it. I was just going to say, I really second all of that. And especially, as you say, allowing for that agency. So asking the person what they need, because someone who's experienced domestic abuse probably hasn't had a lot of choices and a lot of control in their life. And so being able to offer someone a bit of choice and a bit of control and taking ownership of that experience, I think is so important.
And there's one thing I would add is the offering support without pressure is incredibly important. So, of course, if this is a work environment, you may want to say, would you like to know more about the support available through work? Or if you'd like, I can help put you in touch with someone who specializes in this, or you don't have to deal with this on your own, or you can come back and talk to me about this whenever you're ready.
Mm. Yeah, no, that's so important, like letting the person come to you in their own time. And I think hopefully that's also quite reassuring for the people on the receiving end of the sharing or the disclosure to hear, because I think there's people might have ideas about, oh, if someone tells me about this, it is then my responsibility to take that on and essentially give that person advice on what to do next. And ideally, for them to escape their abuse in the long term. But that's usually not what victim survivors want. What they usually want is for someone to listen to them and, as you say, validate their experiences. An employer is not expected to be an expert that is practically solving these problems for the people, but it is just about being that place where people can share and where they can feel safe. And again, where you signpost to that specialist support to the people who are experts. And Emma, if I can ask you to come in as well, what's the approach that Gowling has taken to what I call disclosures, but maybe you would like to call it something else?
Yeah, I have to say up front that I really dislike the term disclosure, and I think that might be a personal thing, but as you said earlier, Christine, it makes me think of something very formal or official, and it doesn't feel the human bit of it feels missing to me. So I shy away from using that term internally, but completely get that it has its place um, in the world. Um, so for us, I guess what we find in the workplace is that actually in reality, people might not always be making a disclosure that they're enduring domestic abuse. They might be sharing bits of information that when you see that whole picture might lead someone to think that something is going on. So maybe saying that their partner checks their phone or they don't have access to money. um, Little bits of information can start to build a picture. And equally, we have had people that have come out and shared that they are in a domestically abusive relationship.
Mm.
We have guidance we've put together for our managers, our line managers, and that's part of our domestic abuse policy that first of all helps them recognize those signs of domestic abuse, but also gives them some tips on how to respond appropriately to people sharing, and very much the things that you were saying, Andrea. So around avoiding judgmental language, an important one, not jumping into fixing mode, because I know a lot of our people in the work context, it's like, right, what can I do? How can I help? Da, 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 do this, do that, do the other. And as you were saying earlier, listen to the person and what they want and go at their speed, and that important signposting piece. The other bit we do is that we recognize that for many of our line managers and even our domestic abuse champions, um, it may be the first time they've had this sort of conversation with somebody. And they may have heard some things that actually are quite distressing for them to hear as a person as well. So what we do is offer them some time to speak to somebody in our team, um, just to download and deal with what they've heard and what they've experienced too. And I think that's really helpful to them. Like I say, particularly if it's the first time they've had to have a conversation like this, the reassurance that what they said in the moment was absolutely fine, that any signposting they did was good, and then also being able to follow up with anything else that we can think of that would be good signposting.
I think that's a really, really good point, providing support, but the supporting in a way so that everyone really has a place to just sense check and share their
Mm.
experiences. I think that's so important because vicarious trauma is real, and we don't want to forget about that when we implement our workplace response. I was going to say, Andrea, you touched on it slightly already, but if I can get just call on my colleague to get another slide up, because we talked about language that might be less
Yeah,
appropriate. We tend to not talk about, like, absolutely do this and absolutely don't do that. But we've got a slide here that just outlines a bit more of the language that can tend to minimize someone's experience of domestic abuse. So, Andrea, I don't know if you have any, if you'd like to take us through some of these.
absolutely. Why didn't you just leave his One of my least favorite ones, to use a bit of a euphemism. I find it quite infuriating because unfortunately it shows a deep lack of understanding for how abuse works, and how isolating and difficult it is for someone who is subjected to that, and how little choices they actually have, especially as when, as Hossam was saying, there's financial abuse weaved in. It's of course for someone who has the privilege to have choices, and it's very easy to say, well, just leave. However, for someone who doesn't have those choices, it becomes incredibly difficult to exercise any kind of agency. The second one, again, an abuser is this. This is the work we keep trying to put into for people to understand. An abuser is someone that looks like all of us. It's not. We keep using language such as monster, and imagining that an abuser is going to have the word abuser tattooed on his forehead. They don't. They are someone's brother, someone's son, someone's sister. It can be unfortunately anyone. It's really hard to know unless you're in that situation with that person. These are very, very good example. There's another one that I find quite dangerous, and that is, I know exactly how you feel. Whatever your personal experience may have been, when someone discloses, it has to be about them, because your personal experience will never be identical to what that person is going through, and you have to give them the chance to tell you and to put their experience at the center. So perhaps some of the examples one might want to try is, what made you decide to tell me today, for example, and that might reveal an incident that kind of made the person tip over, and they might need they might have realized that they need immediate support, or just simply thank you for sharing this with me as a conversation opener, because then they might feel comfortable to share more. I'm here to support you, or I'll explain what happens next so that there are no surprises. That is a good way of guiding someone through the process gently, so that they might understand what the road ahead is. And I always say there are four things you can messages that you can say that would actually make the person feel way more confident to come in and disclose. I believe you. I'm glad you came and trusted me with this. You're in control of what happens next as far as possible. Now, this is a tricky one, because saying I won't tell anyone, unless you can genuinely guarantee confidentiality, that's a tricky one. But you can say you're in control as much as possible, and you don't have to face this alone. It creates that level of confidence for the person to continue on this journey in their own time.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. I think that's really powerful, and just giving that person, again, a sense of agency and choice is really where all of this comes in, and not try to sort of leverage responsibility, like, did you do anything to upset them, for example, or to make them think about professional consequences if the perpetrator happens to be a colleague, for example. So thank you so much. That was really useful, and thank you for the slide as well, Catherine. So I'd like to reflect a little bit on using language inclusively, because I'm aware that when we talk about domestic abuse, there's a lot of language that's also really quite gendered. And I think there are a lot of narratives out there in society about what domestic abuse is, in that it's physical violence, and we tend to ignore the non-physical aspects of it, and also that it's always a man perpetrating abuse against a woman, which might not be the case. And so at IDA, we completely recognize that domestic abuse is, to a large degree, a gendered crime, where the majority of victim survivors are women and the majority of perpetrators are men. However, we try to take a very inclusive approach when we talk about domestic abuse, just because everyone's experiences of domestic abuse are valid. You know, men and boys experience domestic abuse too, both at the hands of same-sex partners, but also opposite-sex partners. There are many different dynamics of domestic abuse that happen in same-sex and other queer relationships that we also want to include. So if I can ask Hossam to come in on this, just how can we make sure that we talk about domestic abuse in a really inclusive way that captures the many different dynamics and constellations that domestic abuse occurs within?
Look, I would love to talk about this. I feel quite strongly about talking about it both professionally and personally. Let me be more vulnerable as someone coming from an Arab background and as a Muslim. That's a topic that is very close to me. I think it's important to be clear that all religions, not just Islam, all faiths don't justify abuse in any form. At their core values, religions teach kindness, compassion, dignity, mercy, and treating others with respect as well. Okay. Sometimes people may say things like, "That's just our culture," or "That's our how things are done in our family," or even saying our religion says the man should be in charge. For me, it's really important to separate culture or religion from abusive behavior. They are not the same thing at all. Every culture has traditions that people value, and every major religion teaches respect, dignity, and compassion. The problem happens when cultural practices or religious teachings are taken out of context and used to justify controlling, to justify harming, or disrespecting another person. This is not culture and that's not religion. It's abuse, completely abuse. One thing I have noticed is that people can sometimes hesitate because they are worried about saying the wrong thing. Sometimes it's a language barrier as well. They don't want to appear culturally insensitive. So they tell themselves maybe this is normal in their community, for example. But if someone is being isolated from their family, prevented from accessing money, constantly threatened, or made to live in fear, those are abusive behaviors regardless of where they happen. What culture someone comes from or what language they speak. It's completely abusive behavior. At the same time, we also have to be careful not to make assumptions. So we shouldn't think this person comes from a particular background, so they must be experiencing this type of abuse. That can create actually stereotypes and can prevent us from truly listening to this individual or those people. Our role is simply to listen, ask open questions, and create a safe space where people can share their experience rather than making assumptions based on their identity or based on their background. For me, inclusive language is not about avoiding difficult conversations, but it's about making sure everyone feels seen, respected, and safe, while also being clear that no one should ever feel they have to accept abuse because of culture, religion, or family expectation. My message is I believe it's universal, no matter where we come from.
Oh, thank you so much, Susan. Oh, it was a great speech. You're getting lots of love in the chat as well from people who agree with you. And yeah,
Could I kindly add one small point?
Yes, Andrea.
About inclusive language. We should also be open to the idea that we need to consider any kind of abuse equally valid and not just assume it can only certainly exactly what Hossam said. When we use the word abuse, there's such a spectrum that we have to be able to expect that the disclosure might even surprise us.
Mm. Completely. And I think you're so reinforcing each other's point here because it's all about being guided in your response by the behavior and not by what we assume about the person or what we assume about the relation I mean, just reminding everyone that domestic abuse does cover abusive behaviors between family members as well, anyone who's personally connected. So, including partners, ex partners, but also people who share responsibility for a child and the wider family. And so, just being mindful that it's always the behavior that should guide our response and not sort of preconceived notions about who people are and their situations. So that was incredibly helpful. Again, the chat is just overflowing with people agreeing with you both, so that's great to see. I'm just gonna pose one last question before we delve into the audience Q&A, and that one is for Emma, because I'm conscious that a lot of what we've talked about is language in conversation and in kind of not personal communications, but like communications towards the organization. But could you give us a quick breakdown of just some pointers for how we should think about language in written records? Because I know that some employers choose to record disclosures, or they might store information safely for a victim survivor if their tech is being monitored and they can't store it on their own laptop. So could you give us some helpful pointers on just what language is useful for written records?
Yeah, so we encourage our domestic abuse champions to keep records of things in case they're needed later. And basically, and I think this is an area where language does really matter, because anything that's written down could be shared, revisited, or relied on later. So the guidance we tend to give our champions is that anything they're writing down as a written record needs to be clear, needs to be accurate. We need dates, times, locations of when those conversations may have happened. And also to make sure that it's not containing any opinions or sort of additional information where they filled in the gaps, that it is an accurate depiction of what was said, ideally trying to use the person's words of what you've been told, and to stay away from things like dramatic language or judgment in anything that's being written down. We do make it clear to them as well that anything that they write, that whoever the employee is would have a right to view that information. So I guess a good sort of rule of thumb. I'm using rule of thumb, and now I don't want to. Now you've taught us what that meant at the beginning of the session. But what we tend to say to our champions is, if they would not feel comfortable with the individual reading back what they've written down, then chances are that it's not a great record that they've written. So to keep that in mind. And we try and be quite open and honest with people as well, to say that we are going to sort of keep a record of what's been happening. Like I say, in case you may need that further down the line, if you need to talk to the police or if something ends up going to court. So I think it's just being really cognitive of what is being captured and being as accurate and factual as possible.
Thank you, Emma. That's super, super helpful. And again, some employers choose to do what Gowling does in recording that disclosure, and some choose not to. So that's completely up to the individual organizations, and there are pros and cons to both. But as you say, to always assume that the victim survivor will read what you have written, I think is a great starting point. Thank you, all three of you. That was such a good discussion. I can't believe we're already done with that segment. But now it's time for the audience Q&A. So please, everyone, if you haven't already done so, submit your questions in the Q&A box. And we've already got lots of questions coming in. And I think I would like to start with something very fundamental, which is a question from Nafisa, which is, should organizations use victim or survivor or victim survivor or person experiencing abuse when they talk about someone who has that experience? Would anyone like to share some views on that?
I'd love to take that if possible.
Sure.
It's something I feel very strongly about, that we've created an odd, strange hierarchy around language, where survivor is treated as enlightened and victim as weak or outdated or somehow offensive. And to me, that framing does not clarify abuse, it just distorts it, because when abuse happens to someone, they are being victimized. Their agency has been taken away, has been overridden by someone else's choices and actions and violence. And the word victim points out that reality, and it tells the truth about what has happened and where responsibility belongs. And of course, survivor is a very important word and it matters, but And it is the right word for a lot of people, and it can reflect endurance and strength and life after abuse. But the two don't mean the same thing, and they should not, survivor should not be used as though they mean the same thing, because if see, they're not on the same timeline. Basically, survivor comes after, and when we rush to replace victim with survivor in every context, we risk doing two things at the same time, erasing that loss of agency at the very heart of the abuse. And then we're also placing pressure on people to sound strong, healed, and recovered before they are ready. And it's not a performance. Healing and recovery are not a performance, and it's not something victims owe to the world, to us, on demand. They can be a victim and they can be a survivor, and they can be both at the same time. But we have to make sure we choose words that are not the most comfortable to everyone else. We have to choose the words that are accurate, honest, and actually centered on the reality of that abuse and what that person is experiencing, rather than the discomfort of actually using the correct language.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important, and not taking agency away from someone, but also not minimizing that they were actually on the receiving end of this kind of experience. Emma, did you want to come in?
I was going to say it's a good question, because we don't use the term victim or survivor really in any of our policies or the various communications really that we do around domestic abuse. We tend to say people that are enduring or experiencing domestic abuse, because that feels like it fits in our workplace in the context, I guess, that we're trying to communicate with people. I feel that it would probably come up more victim or survivor if it was somebody talking about their own experience and how they referred to their own experience, rather than in our policies as saying victims of domestic abuse. But I said that's how it tends to work, yeah, in our organisation.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Hossam, did you want to come in as well?
Yeah, I can't say anything more than what they said. So yeah, I second what they said actually.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And I'm just going to sneak in a little point of my own there as well, because a part of that question was also how should we refer to people who use abuse? And so should we call them perpetrators? Should we call them abuser? And I can just share a bit of a tidbit from a campaign that IDA is currently rolling out with Respect, which is the leading UK charity that do behavior interventions for perpetrators. And I think that it does depend on the context. So if you're speaking to a victim survivor, to be led by what they're calling that person is a useful starting point. Now, there's no necessarily right or wrong answer here. But if you're talking about language in an organizational policy or an organizational procedure, it can be useful to use a term like perpetrator, just so everyone agrees kind of and knows what's going on and what we're talking about. But if you're aiming your communication directly at perpetrators, so for example, if you've got those posters the Gowling have, and if you're signposting to a behavior change service for perpetrators, and the aim of those behavior change services are all to get perpetrators to take accountability and change their behavior. So if you're aiming directly at the person, it might not be so useful to use the term perpetrator, because a lot of perpetrators don't identify as such. So if they read perpetrator, they'll be, oh, that's not me. I just control the finances. So it's more, so maybe you can use slightly, I want to say, softer language that invites that person in and invites a bit of reflection. So Respect uses person causing harm a lot of the time instead of perpetrator. So that's something to have a play around with. So for example, are you worried about your behaviors at home? Instead of asking, are you a perpetrator of domestic abuse? Which might be too direct in that context. And an interesting question from Mandy here. And have the panelists had experiences where a domestic abuse victim survivor is also undergoing performance reviews? Because we know that domestic abuse can sometimes manifest as decreased performance. And so the discussion might first come up in a performance review context, which is difficult for everyone involved. And so just how we use language in that arena is having a positive or a negative impact. Would anyone like to take that on?
It's a good question. I definitely know of experiences that our domestic abuse champions have dealt with where an individual has first shared that domestic abuse is happening because of a performance issue that has sort of brought it to light. I haven't been involved directly in those conversations, but I do know from sort of being involved from the side that they've very much been, I think the first sort of port of call has been that supportive tone of trying to see what we can do and what the person needs to help with that situation happening, alongside and seeing how that can then have a positive impact on the performance issues, which I think probably 9 times out of 10 are very much directly related to what that person is experiencing outside of work. But it's trying to get that balance of giving that support, and ideally getting to the point where they're in a good place, and then hopefully performance will pick up as well.
Yeah. Yeah, no, okay, that's really useful. Hassan, do you have any?
Yeah, I can follow up with this. As I'm from a learning background, we are measuring the people performance and say if they are making defects or not. Once we see that someone is having a high number of defects, we encourage managers to have one-to-one with them. So to identify what is the reason, what is the root cause analysis. One of the main root cause analysis is knowledge gap. It means they don't know about the process or their knowledge is limited. So we can give them training. Another one is the process gap. Which means that the content itself is not updated. There is something wrong about the content or the learning. The third one, which is very, very important, the behavioral gap, which means probably this person has some issues at home, have some problems, which makes them they don't let's say improve their performance. They have some issues, and in this case we encourage managers to support them, to have one-to-ones with them, to send them to the right person. So yes, it could be domestic abuse, one of the things that significantly impact the people performance, and the manager's responsibility is not to tell them but to guide them to the right people who can support them in the work.
No, that's really helpful. And that is one of the ways that employers can make sure to embed their domestic abuse response in their organizational processes, is having questions about safety at home and things like that in performance review conversations, in pregnancy risk assessments, in return from leave conversations when someone's been on sick leave or even on a long annual leave. So that's a great point. I'm so conscious that we're coming up to time, but Andrea, if I could ask you to give me a very, very quick,
a very, very short point. I mean, there is a legal aspect to this that we need to be mindful of. Tying the two together very directly can risk further harm. So the conversation, if there is a conversation in a performance review that brings in any kind of abuse that's been disclosed, has to be done in a way that's trauma informed and again avoids any kind of further harm to the person.
That's really helpful. And I'm aware that there are other questions in the Q&A box that we haven't had time to answer, so we will do our best to answer them in the follow-up email that we'll be sending out tomorrow with a recording to this webinar. So on that happy note, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to Andrea, to Emma, and to Hossam for sharing your insights and for sharing your guidance and your practical guidance. This discussion has been very illuminating, and we really encourage people to not only share the recording within their organizations, but to download the IDA language guide, which my colleague will post a link to it in the chat, because the IDA language guide covers all of the points that we've touched on today. So things like inclusivity, written records, what language might be most appropriate and what language that might not be so appropriate. So that's a resource that you can refer back to when you figure out what kind of language that you use in the workplace to talk about domestic abuse. So just a final reminder that we'll post the recording on our YouTube channel tomorrow, and that we'll be sharing those additional resources in the follow-up email and try to answer all of your questions so that we can help you navigate those workplace conversations around domestic abuse. And our next Insight Hour will be on the 29th of September, and we're going to be discussing the role of managers in the workplace response to domestic abuse, which I think is something that most organizations will probably think about at some point. There is a link in the chat where you can sign up to that Insight Hour at the end of summer. And I would just like to say thank you again. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for everyone who attended, and have a great summer.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Take care.